Welcome back, everyone. Now, there's a big dispute between the federal government and state governments, and federal overreach is becoming one of the big topics in this country. But Americans have a certain power which may let them challenge this. That's the Convention of States. Here to speak with us about this is Mark Meckler. He's president of Conventions of States Action. Hey, Mark, real pleasure having you on.
Good morning. Good to be with you.
So why don't you start off, tell us what Convention of States is. What is this?
Sure. Well, in Article 5 of the United States Constitution are the methodologies by which we can amend the Constitution. The second clause of Article 5 says that the states, when two-thirds of them request it, can gather in convention and propose amendments, and it was specifically inserted there to give the states power to push back against federal tyranny. So Convention of States as an organization is spearheading that effort. It takes 34 states to call a convention. So far, 15 states have done so.
Now, I understand a lot of people might be concerned about the idea of changing the Constitution, but what would you tell them?
Really, what we're looking to do is not change the Constitution, but restore the Constitution. If you've looked at what the courts have done to the Constitution over the last really 115 years or so, they've essentially taken what were limited enumerated powers given to the federal government, and they've expanded them dramatically. They're now basically unlimited, unenumerated, and the power pyramid has been flipped on its head. Most of the power now resides at the level of the federal government instead of the states. And we're just trying to right the ship and put the power back in the states instead of the federal government.
And so this is proposing amendments, not altering the Constitution. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, I think people worry about, they call it a constitutional convention, thinking we're going to rewrite the entire Constitution. This is actually limited in scope. There are three things that the states are proposing that we discuss in convention. One is anything that would put fiscal limits on the federal government, like a balanced budget amendment or limits on taxes and spending. Second is anything that would impose term limits on the federal government, federal officials. That would include Congress, of course, but also bureaucrats and staffers, what we know as the deep state. And third is anything that would impose structural or power limits on the federal government. These are things like telling the federal government, no, you're not able to be involved in energy or the environment or education.
And what would stop this from, for example, leading to different states putting in amendments that maybe people don't want, such as expanding government power, like we saw under Lyndon B. Johnson or something?
Well, the states have to agree on the same resolution in order to get to convention, and it is called making something aggregate. So in order for all of these resolutions to aggregate and reach the requisite 34, they have to be the same. And so all the states are passing the same resolution whereby they agree in advance what will be talked about in convention. Anything that is brought up at convention that doesn't fit within that, what I call the law of convention passed by the states, is non-germane and would just be ruled out of order.
And how is this different, for example, from Congress right now being able to write amendments? How is this any different?
It's not in the sense that Congress requires two-thirds of both houses to propose an amendment. There have literally been thousands of amendments proposed by Congress. And then those amendments have to pass out to the states for ratification. It takes 3/4 of states to ratify. So what I would say, the main difference is that people trust themselves and the people a lot more than they trust Congress. Congress is a sitting convention of states every single day that they're in. If we're not worried about Congress, we certainly shouldn't be worried about the people proposing amendments.
And so this would allow the states to bypass Congress for this. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that's the most important piece of this is Congress is not involved, the president's not involved. This allows the people to bypass, and that was the specific purpose. In 1787 at convention, Colonel George Mason stood up 2 days before the end of convention and explained to everybody at convention they had a fundamental problem with the document. They'd given the power to Congress to propose amendments, but they'd not given that same power to the people acting through the states. And he asked the men assembled if they were so naive that they believed that a Congress or a federal government that had become a tyranny would propose amendments to restrain their own tyranny. The answer is really obvious. If you look at what Congress did or what the convention did at that point, Madison's notes say nin com, which means no comment. There was no debate. And in fact, they unanimously adopted a provision giving us the power to do this. And that's how we got the power today.
That's interesting. Can you tell us a bit about the history of this? This was created to make sure that government, if further down the road you had pretty much a deep state like we have now, that they would not create laws to limit their own power, and this was given to the states to limit that. Is this accurate? How did this whole thing play out?
Yeah, that is accurate. And what's interesting is we've never used this power. So in over 240 years of the existence of our constitutional republic, we've never reached the requisite 2/3 of states. It's not for lack of trying. There have been over 400 applications made for a convention of states. We've just never reached 34, the requisite 2/3 of states who agree on what to discuss. There's also never been a national effort made like this. And so people have been trying, people have not organized in this way. But today we have over 5 million people in the organization who are organized doing this. We have representatives, volunteers, supporters in all 50 states in every single congressional and state legislative district. So this organized effort's never been done before in this way. It truly is historic.
If we go back in history, what was the discussion, the content of the discussion on why this would be necessary?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the founders had an understanding of human nature, and that understanding was that when people get power, they want more power. And when people get power, they bring more power to themselves. So there was a fear, and they had this experience that a central government disconnected from the people would become too powerful and would become unresponsive to the people. And that's where we are today. If you look at history, for example, over 80 to 85% of people consistently polled for the last 30 years say we should have term limits for Congress. Congress has never and will never propose term limits for itself. The numbers are very similar, by the way, on a balanced budget amendment. Americans understand that you can't keep spending beyond your means forever, that at some point you have to rein in your fiscal house. And the founders knew this, and they actually rallied against and railed against the idea of long-term debt, structural debt. Today, obviously, we're like close to $29 trillion in debt. And yet the American people who don't want it, the Congress will never propose an amendment for a balanced budget amendment. So it's always been up to the people. The founders knew it would be up to the people. And this was considered the firewall for liberty, that the states and the people could act and rein in a rogue or out of control federal government.
Now, as things currently stand, the Senate, the House, they're trying to push through H.R. 1, which would let them basically institutionalize from the federal level all the changes they made to the elections during the 2020 elections. And, you know, of course, there's different views in this. I think a lot of conservatives view this as kind of the end of fair elections, where the federal government's basically going to start running elections. Could something like this change this? Could this reverse this?
It could, and I agree with those who think that this is a game changer, what the House and Senate are trying to do right now. They call it the For the People Act. I actually call it the Destruction of Democracy Act, or the Death of Democracy Act. They intend to take the power away from the states, the fundamental power to decide how their elections run. That's something that was never intended by the federal government. They intend to do away with voter ID laws, one of the most simple protections we can and should have in states against voter fraud. One of the things that H.R. 1, or the Death of Democracy Act, does that I think is so dangerous is it exposes the donor lists of organizations like ours. And the intent is that the woke mob, the cancel culture, will go after any donors that support Convention of States, by the way, also churches and other charities, and prevent them from doing the work they do. So I think this is very dangerous. And in a Convention of States, we could propose, and then the country could ultimately ratify a structure whereby all of this power is permanently reserved to the states. And there's no question that the federal government is not allowed to federalize all of our elections.
The other big question is enforcement. You know, of course, we have a constitution right now that is arguably not always followed, including by our Supreme Court. What would you tell people if they doubt this would actually be enforced, even if it did go through?
Yeah, I think that's actually one of the best arguments I heard against it. I'm a little bit biased. It was my main argument when I first started looking at this. And I learned something that was actually stunning and upsetting to me, which is we have two constitutions in America. We have the one that a lot of people carry around in their breast pocket. It's called the Pocket Constitution. Usually about 14 pages, our entire Constitution. And then we have the one that you can buy from the government publishing office. I actually have one on the bookshelf behind me. It's 2,738 pages with the supplements to bring it current. It's over 3,000 pages. Literally says on the spine, the Constitution of the United States of America. It contains every case ever issued by the Supreme Court, telling us what that beautiful, succinct Constitution is supposed to mean. And this is the document, this 3,000-page behemoth that has really distorted and bastardized our Constitution and has essentially destroyed the Republic. So the goal of Convention of States is to go back to something closer to that original Constitution. This is the methodology that the founders gave us. Now, why would they follow it if we were to amend? If we look at the history, and that's really the only lamplight by which we can guide our feet, if we look at the history of amendments, amendments are generally followed for at least 100 years. And the reason is they're a very muscular political operation. It takes 34 states to call. It takes 38 states to ratify. That means the vast majority of the American public is in support of whatever gets ratified coming out of a convention. Politicians, not the bravest souls in the world, they generally don't stand against 3/4 of the American population.
And on that note, too, let's talk about where things are at. How many states are behind this right now? How many more do you still need?
So again, it takes 2/3 or 34 states to call a convention. So far, 15 states have called the convention all the way. 49 states have actually introduced this resolution. 30 states have passed it out of one committee or another in either house. 23 states have passed it in one house or another, but you have to do it in both houses in the same calendar session. And so far, 15 states have done that completely. Today, there are 21 states in session considering this. I expect that we will pass somewhere between 5 and 10 states this year, taking us well past the halfway mark.
And let's say it does get passed, does go through. This is brought to the state decision. What is the process? How does this actually play out?
So what happens is the states will then gather in what's called a general convention. A general convention just means that all of the states will be invited. All 50 states will send delegations. They'll go to convention. They'll decide on a rules package. It'll look to those of us who know legislatures much like a legislature. They'll end up breaking out into committees and subcommittees. They'll come back to what they call the committee of the whole convention, and they'll vote on proposals for amendments. If 26 states can agree on an amendment or a package of amendments, then those amendments will be sent out to the states for ratification. And this is really important. Some people panic about the idea of a convention. A convention is merely a meeting where people get together, discuss, debate, and then make some suggestions. The convention itself has absolutely no power constitutionally. And then those amendments, if they're passed out of convention, go out to the states for ratification. And it takes a super majority or 38 states to ratify anything before it becomes part of the Constitution. So that's the process.
In terms of the reality of this, 38 states, that's a pretty big call, especially if it's reigning in the powers of government. Who makes the decision on ratifying it? And really, how many states currently do you think would be behind that, if that were to happen?
So generally speaking, it's the state legislatures that will ratify. There are two potential methods. This is one of the rare areas where Congress has some say. It's either state legislatures or state ratifying conventions. The convention themselves are controlled by the state legislature, so really basically the same process either way. So it's up to the states. And then the question of ratification, I think it sounds a little bit counterintuitive. I think it's harder to get to convention than it is to ratify, even though the number is smaller for getting to convention. And the reason I say that is getting to convention, it's a new idea. To some people, it seems radical. Once you get close and get into convention, the entire country will be paying attention. This will be the biggest political event in American history. Quite literally, it'll be watched on every television network. It'll be on C-SPAN. It'll be in the schools from kindergarten all the way through college. Everybody will be aware of it. And the only things that will come out of convention are things that are very mainstream, like a balanced budget amendment with 85% support or term limits with a similar amount of support. These are things that the American people understand. They're quite simple. They're down the middle. They're very moderate reforms as far as political ideology. So I think getting to 38 states, once you get to the 34 and get out of convention, I actually think that's a lower bar.
Now, and what's to stop them, for example, from repealing things like Second Amendment protections, free speech protections?
Yeah, look, I hear this all the time that they're going to repeal the Second Amendment. To be clear, my son's a Marine. My mom was a cop. We're big Second Amendment people, so I don't believe the Second Amendment is at risk. In fact, sitting on my legal advisory board, Chuck Cooper. Chuck is the longest-term litigator for the NRA, litigated Second Amendment cases. He's written a letter that says the idea that this would do away with the Second Amendment or damage it is outrageous. It's the federal government we really have to worry about. And here's what actually prevents it, just common sense-wise and numerically. It takes 38 states to ratify, and that means it takes 13 states to not ratify, 13 states who just don't pass or approve of an amendment. And if you think of it in terms of the Second Amendment, it takes the 13 most conservative states to stand against this. And so states like Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi and Tennessee, the Carolinas, Wyoming, the Dakotas, places where gun culture runs deep. And by the way, Texas is not among the 13 most conservative states in the country, if that gives you any idea. I've been in 48 states. I've been in the legislatures in most of them. And I would tell you that if you go into those legislatures and you suggest that they even debate an amendment to repeal the Second Amendment, well, I hope you're carrying, because you probably need to be to defend yourself. And I've made this challenge. I'll put this out on the air with you guys. is I give out my personal email address. It's mmeckler@cosaction.com. And I'll challenge anybody, if you think that the Second Amendment can be repealed, then send me the list of the 38 states that'll ratify it. I've made that offer to millions of people. I've never received a single email in response to that. It's literally just impossible.
And I've also heard the left, liberal groups say, oh, they could, repeal, they could bring back slavery or something like this. What would you tell them?
Yeah, I mean, that's just outrageous. I would just say use your common sense. Go look in the country and look around the country and find the states that are promoting bringing back slavery. I mean, these are just absurd, ridiculous arguments that you'll hear from people who are opposed on either side. Really what you have is you have the mainstream of America, sort of the great center of America is in support of this. We've polled this all across the country. It's about 2/3 of Americans overall are in favor of holding a convention of states for this reason. It's about 75% of Republicans, about 2/3 of independents, and even more than 50%, usually 52, 54% of Democrats are in favor of this. So this is mainstream America against the fringes.
Now, I can tell you, I've heard all kinds of rumors about it. From the right and the left, I know I've heard rumors that George Soros is financing it. I've heard from the John Birch Society there's concerns about it. I've heard all kinds of groups, right and left. What's really going on here with all this?
Yeah, I love this. Just in the last couple of weeks, there have been hit piece articles against me personally in Convention of States. One of them did come from the John Birch Society. All 12 of them out there in the country wrote an article saying that we're owned by George Soros and we're a radical leftist organization. Literally in the same week, an article was put out by Common Dreams, which is an agglomeration of Common Cause, Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, both of those Soros-funded organizations, and a conglomeration of over 250 leftist organizations, Code Pink, MoveOn.org, Daily Cause, Socialist Party of America, all the major employee unions, and all of those organizations say that I am and we are a radical right-wing organization. So what you have is the fringe on both sides are really opposed to this. They're really scared of it. And the reason they're scared of it is because this is intended to take the power away from Washington, D.C., where all those groups are most effective operating and seizing power and giving it back to the states. The reality is we're funded by close to now 100,000 small donors from all over the country. You're looking at my fancy office here in my house. My wife works in a high-rise. She's our development director. She raises the money for the organization. I call it a high-rise because it's the office over the garage. So, we're not funded by big corporations. We're not funded by Soros or the Koch brothers. It's really just grassroots folks like me all over the country.
And so you're suggesting there's a kind of a disinformation campaign around this. Who is behind this? Which groups are running this and why?
Well, look, it originally started, the left started a disinformation campaign in the 1970s against Article 5. Article 5 was really proposed seriously to overturn Roe versus Wade back in the 1970s. And Chief Justice Warren Burger wrote a letter against the idea of using an Article 5 convention. Of course, he's the Chief Justice that gave us Roe versus Wade. He wrote an article or a letter saying we would lose our beloved Constitution in a runaway convention. They then hired or found professors at Yale and Harvard to write similar articles. They were trying to prevent the American right from using the constitutional remedy that the founders intended we use for just such a circumstance. Unfortunately, some on the right have picked it up. Today on the right, it's fringe groups like the John Birch Society and Eagle Forum. Those are really the only major groups that oppose this. And on the left, it's virtually everybody on the left. By the way, on the right, and this is important for folks to know, if you consider yourself a conservative or a libertarian, every major conservative or libertarian figure in the United States of America that's taken a position on this subject, if they're nationally known, they've taken a position in favor, and all the radical leftist organizations in America have taken a position against.
Yeah, and I've heard different takes on. I know there's this Stop Constitutional Convention movement, and I know they're concerned about kind of this running away. What would you tell them? A runaway convention, what would you tell them?
Yeah, I would tell them just, can you do math? Because the numbers make it impossible. I laid it out. It takes only 13 states to stop anything. There are numerous protections along the way. My legal advisory board is made up of the finest conservative constitutional scholars in America and the finest libertarian constitutional scholars in America. Robbie George at Princeton is on my legal advisory board. Randy Barnett, who runs the Georgetown Center for the Constitution. Rob Nadelson, who is the #1 legal scholar in America on Article 5, is on the legal advisory board. Mark Levin, all of these people against the John Birch Society, a fringe group, by the way, this is very important for people to understand, that was run out of the legitimate conservative movement, literally run out by William F. Buckley, the founder of the conservative movement, Barry Goldwater, Ronald Reagan. These are kooks and quacks, to be quite simple. The current president of the John Birch Society said of Ronald Reagan when he was running for president that he was a lackey for the communists. So you have to look at who's for and who's against. The rational people, the scholars, the nationally known figures on the right, all in favor, the radical left, all against. You got to ask yourself, why are groups like the John Birch Society and Eagle Forum aligning with groups like Planned Parenthood and Code Pink?
Now, you mentioned, of course, the changes to the Constitution that have already been made in terms of pretty much every time the Supreme Court rules on something, it kind of creates a new interpretation. These interpretations work almost like amendments. You mentioned if you were to get from the government the copy of the Constitution, it's quite big. Could this actually undo some of that, given that this is based on interpretations?
Yeah, it absolutely could and should undo some of this. This is really what the founders intended. This is why they put Article 5 in. They understood that the federal government would get out of control and we needed to rein it in. It's really obvious that the founders intended amendments to rein in the Supreme Court as well. After the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights as we commonly know them, the 11th Amendment was the first amendment, of course, after the first 10, and it was put in place during the time of the founders. Almost all the founders and the framers were still alive. The Supreme Court took jurisdiction over things that the founders didn't agree with, and the founders limited Supreme Court jurisdiction through the 11th Amendment. So they sent a message to us over 240 years ago telling us that the Supreme Court gets out of control if it does things that we don't like, if it takes jurisdiction over things we don't believe it should have, then the proper process for fixing that is the amendments process. And back then they counted on Congress to do it, but the founders were in Congress. Today, Congress is very different, and we, the people, are going to have to do it for ourselves.
What are the current amendments that your group is proposing?
So as a group, we don't actually propose any particular amendments. They're what are called subject matter areas. And so what we're proposing is that a discussion be held around 3 subject matters. One is fiscal restraints on the federal government. So I mentioned a balanced budget amendment, tax and spending caps. Another one that a lot of people think is a good idea and very popular, imposing generally accepted accounting principles on the federal government. The federal government, I don't know exactly how they account. I've tried to talk to government accountants, ask them about it. They use no standards. I call it sort of the unicorns and rainbow standard. They just make it up as they go. So anything that would impose fiscal restraints is available for discussion. Second is anything that would impose term limits. Most people, when they talk about term limits, they talk about Congress, and that could be a good idea. But I think it's equally important if we're going to put term limits on elected officials that we also put term limits on the staffers who have a lot of power on Capitol Hill and the bureaucrats frankly have the most power on Capitol Hill. So those would be term limits. By the way, also the judiciary. Nobody ever intended at the founding for people to serve on the federal courts for 25 and 30 years. The average age of appointment in the founding era was 47. Average life expectancy was 54. So you get an idea, maybe 6-7 years on the court is all they ever intended. So we could limit the terms of federal jurists, including the Supreme Court. And then the final area is imposing scope and jurisdictional limits. A very good example of this is the Department of Education. The founders never intended for the federal government to be involved in education in any way. We've not had an education amendment. We know this for certain because Jefferson wrote in a letter to William Henry Lee, one of his close friends, that he could not ask for money for University of Virginia from the federal government because it was unconstitutional and it would require an education amendment. We've not had such an amendment. The federal government shouldn't be spending money on education or energy or the environment. These are places that they were never intended to be involved in. And a convention of states under the auspices that we're calling it would allow for a discussion of amendments to restrain the federal government in these areas and many more.
Now, I know one of the big concerns right now is federal government overreach. Have you seen more support for this since Biden's been doing these executive orders and such?
Yeah, support is off the charts. It's been quite incredible to see the transition. I mean, we've been a very successful organization over the last 7 years, over 5 million people involved. Something unique happened just before the election. Facebook turned off political advertising. I think that hurt people on the right much more than people on the left, and we certainly felt the effect of it as an organization. But what we noticed is when Biden was elected, there was an incredible surge in interest in convention of states, and the advertising had not yet been turned back on. Facebook turned that on just a couple of days ago, but we've seen a huge uptick in interest in convention of states, including from people who used to be opposed. Some of these organizations, the people are peeling off of these organizations and coming to convention of states because they see we're at a point where we don't really have much choice. The Marxists, the fascists are really in control of Washington, D.C. They hold the White House and they hold both houses of Congress. People are genuinely worried about that, and they see convention of states as the only potential remedy.
Now, I was interested to see that David Horowitz actually came out in support of it too. What was his general statement on this?
Yeah, it was really interesting. I interacted with Horowitz when he first came to me. He told me he was completely opposed. I laid out some of the case for it, and he asked me to send him all original source material. He said he wanted to do his own research. And when he came back about a week later, he told me that he was completely in support. He'd do anything we needed. And he wrote an article basically saying that the campaign against the idea of using Article 5 was a leftist propaganda campaign. David Horowitz, of course, is the premier scholar on the left, the modern American left. And so he said this is classic leftist propaganda to turn people on the right against themselves, against using the remedy that they know will save the country. And so he came out strongly in favor. Folks can go to our website at conventionofstates.com, look up David Horowitz. They'll see this article. He did the independent research. He says we need to call a convention of states. And he says that those who are against it, who might consider themselves on the right, have simply been fooled by leftist propaganda.
Now, just last question here. I guess first off, do you feel that there's anything people are missing in their understanding of this? And second, I know there's still a lot of people who have a lot of concerns about this. What would you tell them?
I think that what people are missing, the most important thing they're missing is they're panicked about the idea of going to convention. And they need to understand that a convention of states, as laid out in the United States Constitution, actually has no power. In other words, their job is to get together, have a discussion, and then make suggestions. Literally nothing can come out of a convention other than suggestions. Then it has to go to 38 states to be ratified. You said yourself, very high bar. I do agree, it's a very high bar. The founders intended this process to be incredibly difficult. People ask, Mark, you've been doing this 7 years. Why is it taking so long? And I say because that's what the founders intended. They wanted to make sure that we were unified as a nation around any change that we would make to the Constitution. So it takes millions of people, many years, the building of a broad consensus. So I think people who have fear need to remember the founders, they faced much more dire circumstances than we did. They fought a revolution where the outcome was uncertain. They got together and designed a constitution where the outcome was uncertain. And the question that we have to ask ourselves as citizens is, do we walk in their footsteps? Do we deserve to put on their shoes and call ourselves Americans? And I think if we do, we have to be bold, we have to be brave, we have to be courageous, and we have to use the tools the founders called us to use. And we have to call a convention of states. Folks can get involved at conventionofstates.com.
Hey, Mark Meckler, real pleasure having you on Crossroads.
Thank you for having me. I'm here live in Philadelphia at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. When you hear the phrase lives, fortunes, and sacred honor, these are the folks we should think of, those who anonymously gave their lives. Well, today you have a chance to volunteer. You need to volunteer for conventionofstates.com, the movement that's going to save the country. These folks are willing to step up and give everything. We need you to give just a little bit. Go to conventionofstates.com and volunteer today.